More than 31 million Americans claim Irish ancestry. That is nearly 10 times the population of Ireland itself. When those Americans are asked where their people came from, many of them say the same word, Dublin. But Dublin is not simply a city on a map. It is a question that 12 centuries of history have not finished answering. How does a small settlement on a rainy island at the edge of Europe produce a culture so stubborn, so alive, so impossible to ignore that it travels across oceans and takes root in foreign soil and refuses to disappear even after generations? The answer begins at a river, at a dark pool where two waters meet, at a place that had no reason to become important and became, despite everything, one of the most contested and consequential cities in the Western world. We are going back to where it started, to the year 841, to a bend in the Liffey that changed everything. Chapter 1. The Black Pool. The name is older than the city. Dublin. 2 words in Old Irish. Dub, meaning black. Lin, meaning pool. Not a poetic invention. Not a name chosen for beauty or significance, but a practical description of something that actually existed at the confluence of 2 rivers on the eastern coast of Ireland. A dark tidal pool where the River Poddle met the Liffey, its water stained by the peaty soil of the land it drained, sitting roughly where Dublin Castle stands today. Before there were streets or walls or markets or any of the things that make a place into a city, there was that pool, and before the pool had a name in any surviving language, people had already been living beside it for a very long time. Ireland in the centuries before 841 was not empty ground waiting to be discovered. It was a functioning, layered society with its own laws, its own literature, and its own deeply rooted sense of itself. The Gaelic world that occupied the island was organised around a system of small kingdoms called Tuatha, each with its own king, its own territory, its own web of obligations and alliances. There was no single Irish king in this period, no central authority speaking for the whole island. Power was distributed, contested, and constantly renegotiated. That was not a weakness. That was simply how the world worked here. The land around the Liffey crossing had 2 names, and the fact that it carried both tells you something important about its character from the very beginning. Dublin described the pool and the ground immediately around it, the older and more elemental name rooted in the physical fact of the water. But the same settlement was also called Athcliath, the ford of the hurdles, referring to a crossing point on the Liffey made from woven branches and timber. One name described where people gathered, the other described how people moved. Together they described a place defined by water, by crossing, by the constant passage of people and goods from one side to another. Any community that controlled this junction controlled movement through the region. The Liffey reached the Irish Sea a short distance to the east. The Poddle came in from the south. The tidal pool at their meeting was sheltered, deep enough for small vessels, and surrounded by terrain that offered natural defence. People had understood the value of this location for centuries before anyone wrote it down. The clearest early window into this world comes from the ecclesiastical record. By the 6th and 7th centuries, monastic communities had become the organising centres of Irish life in ways going well beyond simple religious practice. Irish monasteries in this period were not quiet retreats from the world. They were the world. They functioned simultaneously as centres of worship, centres of learning, scriptoria, where manuscripts were copied and preserved, guest houses for travellers, hospitals, and economic hubs organising the agricultural life of surrounding territory. The Book of Kells. created by monks working somewhere in the Irish or Scottish world around 800, is the most famous surviving example of what this civilization was capable of producing. If you have ever seen even a reproduction of its pages, the gold and the interlaced figures and the colours that have not faded in 1200 years, you understand that the people who made it were not operating at the margins of the known world. They were operating at what they understood to be its centre: learning, beauty, and the preservation of knowledge organised their lives. And those values produced objects that still stop people cold in museum galleries today. What the monasteries needed, beyond faith and learning, was connectivity, routes for pilgrims, for traders, for the flow of goods and ideas that kept a network alive. The junction at the Liffey and the Poddle was exactly the kind of node that a network like this depended on. Not yet a city in any formal sense, but already functioning as a place that held things together, a point where routes converged and the business of the world got done. The landscape around it was not the streetscape you would find today. Forest covered much of the surrounding land, managed rather than wild, providing timber and game and raw materials for construction. The river valleys were cleared for farming. The estuary a few miles east gave access to sea routes connecting Ireland to Britain, to Gaul, to the wider world of early medieval trade. Archaeological work carried out across Dublin over many decades, much of it during construction projects exposing the deep layers beneath the modern city, has recovered objects placing this settlement within a trading network far larger than its modest footprint suggests. Evidence of metalworking, traces of organised food production, fragments pointing to contact with communities across the Irish Sea. The people here were not isolated, they were connected. The Gaelic society that produced this settlement had its own deeply developed relationship with conflict. The small kingdoms fought each other constantly, but those conflicts were governed by law and custom. Cattle raids were the most common form of military activity, more about demonstrating power and redistributing wealth than about permanently occupying another people's territory and replacing their culture with your own. You fought. You won or lost. You negotiated. Life continued. That understanding of conflict, embedded deeply in how Irish society organised itself, would matter enormously when different people arrived from the north. People with longships and iron weapons and a completely different philosophy about what you did with a place once you had taken it. In the year 841, according to the Annals of Ulster, one of the most important chronicle sources for early Irish history, a Viking long fort was established on the Liffey. A long fort was not a temporary camp, it was a fortified harbour, a base designed for overwintering, for storing ships, for mounting operations extending beyond a single raiding season. The men who built it were not planning to leave at the end of summer. They were planning to stay, and in staying, they would build something neither they nor anyone else had planned. The dark pool on the Liffey was about to become a city. Chapter 2. The Raiders Who Stayed. Picture the Irish coast in the summer of 795. A monastery on the island of Rathlin off the northern shore. Stone buildings, manuscript cases, the accumulated wealth of generations stored in a place built for prayer, not for defence. Monks going about the business of a morning. Then the ships appear. The first recorded Viking raid on Ireland came that summer, and the pattern it established repeated itself with increasing intensity over the following decades. Monasteries were the primary targets, not from any theological grievance, but because monasteries were where the wealth was. Gold altar vessels, jewelled manuscript covers, the agricultural surplus of generations, all of it stored in places not designed to resist men arriving fast from the sea with iron weapons and no intention of negotiating. The raids followed a rhythm. Ships arrived in summer when the seas allowed. Communities were overwhelmed before any effective response could form. Goods and people were taken. The ships left. Communities rebuilt and waited. Then, in 841, the rhythm broke. In that year, the Vikings did not leave at the end of summer. They built a long fort on the Liffey and stayed. This is the moment historians identify as the founding of Dublin as a permanent settlement. And the location was not chosen casually. The confluence of the Liffey and the Poddle was precisely the kind of sheltered, navigable, defensible site that Norse navigators had been identifying across the North Atlantic and along the river systems of continental Europe for decades. They understood water the way other people understood land. A tidal pool deep enough for longships, close enough to the sea for rapid departure if needed, surrounded by terrain that could be fortified. They recognized it the moment they saw it. But here is what the popular image of Vikings in Ireland consistently misses. The men who built the long fort at Dublin were not only raiders, they were traders. In the Norse world of the 9th century, those two activities were more connected than the modern imagination tends to allow. Violence was one way of acquiring wealth. Commerce was another. The same people who had been raiding the Irish coast were participants in a trading network extending from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, from the rivers of Russia to the Atlantic seaboard of Europe. What they recognized in Dublin was not just a defensible position. They recognized a commercial node. Within a generation of the Longfort's establishment, the settlement on the Liffey had begun functioning as a trading centre of a kind Ireland had not previously seen. The archaeological record recovered from beneath modern Dublin tells this story in physical detail. Excavations carried out at Wood Quay in the late 1970s and early 1980s, before and during a controversy over a proposed civic development that would have covered the site permanently, revealed the texture of Viking Dublin preserved in extraordinary condition in the waterlogged soil along the riverbank. Post and wattle houses, small by modern standards but well engineered for the Irish climate. Around and between them, the debris of daily life. Leather shoes in quantities pointing to a substantial manufacturing industry. Wooden combs, bone needles, animal bones recording what people ate. The evidence of craft production at a scale serving a market that reached across a wide Norse trading world. The commodity that drove much of Dublin's early commercial power, and the one that the city's more celebratory histories have most consistently avoided, was human beings. Dublin in the 9th and 10th centuries was among the most significant slave markets in the northern European world. Raiders brought captives from Ireland, from Britain, from the coasts of France. Those captives were assessed and sold in a market that treated people as cargo, based on comparative archaeological analysis and the chronicle evidence examined by scholars of early medieval slavery. Tens of thousands of people may have passed through Dublin's slave market over the course of the Viking centuries. The precise figure cannot be established with certainty. What can be established is that this trade was substantial, that the wealth it generated was foundational to Dublin's early commercial power, and that it was paid for in human suffering at a scale the city long preferred not to acknowledge. The population of Viking Dublin was never purely Norse. From early in the settlement's history, the evidence points to a community mixing Norse settlers with Gaelic Irish in ways producing something genuinely new. Historians call this hybrid culture Hiberno-Norse, and the term captures something real. Within a generation or two of the Longfort's establishment, there were families in Dublin who were neither straightforwardly Viking nor straightforwardly Irish. They spoke forms of both languages. They practiced elements of both cultures. Norse men married Irish women. Irish craftsmen worked in Norse-run workshops. The kings of Dublin in this period were themselves often of mixed ancestry within a few generations. The city the Vikings built was not a foreign colony dropped onto Irish soil. It was something the two worlds made together, imperfectly and without planning, in the daily friction of proximity. The political history of Viking Dublin reached its most famous crisis at a place called Clontarf, on the shore of Dublin Bay. On the 23rd of April, in the year 1014, the standard version of Clontarf goes like this. Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, led a unified Irish army against a Viking coalition, broke Norse power in Ireland forever, and died at the moment of his triumph, killed in his tent by a fleeing Norse warrior named Brodir. It is a satisfying story. It is also significantly incomplete. Clontarf was not a clean confrontation between Irish defenders and Norse invaders. The coalition facing Brian Boru included both Norse warriors and Irish kings with their own political reasons for opposing Brian's dominance. Among his opponents was Mael Mordor, King of Leinster, a native Irish ruler. Among Brian's own forces were Norse warriors fighting on the Irish side. The battle was, in the terms of its own time, a contest over who would dominate Ireland, not a war between Ireland and a foreign occupier. What Clontarf ended was not the Norse presence in Dublin. The Norse community survived the battle, continued to inhabit the city, continued to trade, continued to develop the Hiberno-Norse culture that had been building for 2 centuries. What ended was the political ambition of Dublin's Norse kings to be major actors in the contest for Irish high kingship. After 1014, they became subordinate to competing Irish kingdoms rather than independent forces in their own right. Brian Boru did not survive to build whatever Ireland he had imagined. His death on the day of victory meant that the political architecture he had been constructing died with him. Dublin's Viking centuries left the city with a lesson it would need more than once. Military victory was not the same thing as political permanence. You could win the battle and still lose the argument that followed it. The city that the Vikings had built on the Dark Pool was not destroyed at Clontarf. It was inherited, and the people about to inherit it most completely were coming from Normandy, by way of England, carrying a conception of power that would change Dublin more thoroughly than any longship ever had. Chapter 3. The Norman Trap. 1169 is one of those dates that Irish history returns to with a particular mix of anger, regret, and the specific discomfort of a story that does not have a villain simple enough to satisfy anyone looking for one. The Norman invasion of Ireland, which began that year with a landing on the Wexford coast, is remembered as the opening of 800 years of English involvement in Irish affairs. The original wound. That framing is not wrong, but it leaves out the part that makes 1169 something more complicated than foreign aggression. The Normans were asked, Diarmait mac Morshada, King of Leinster, was by all surviving accounts a formidable and not particularly scrupulous political operator. He had held power since 1126 through military force, strategic alliance, and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that successful rule in the competitive world of Irish kingship required. Then, in 1166, his enemies outmaneuvered him. Ruaidrí Ua Conchobair, the High King, moved against him in coalition with other Irish kings, and Diarmait found himself stripped of his kingdom and forced into exile. He went to England. He obtained permission from King Henry II to recruit military help from among the Anglo-Norman lords of Wales, and he found Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, known to history by the nickname that has outlasted almost everything else about him, Strongbow. Strongbow was powerful but politically marginal in the Anglo-Norman world, land-rich in theory and struggling in practice. The offer Diarmait made him was one a man in his position could not easily refuse. Help me recover Leinster. Diarmait said, "and I will give you my daughter Aoife in marriage, and the right to succeed me as King of Leinster." This was an extraordinary offer. It was also, by the rules of the Gaelic political world, an irregular one. Kingship in Ireland did not pass through marriage or inheritance in the way Norman feudal custom understood succession. Diarmait was making promises in one political language to men who heard them in another. Whether he understood the gap between what he was offering and what they were hearing is a question history cannot answer. Strongbow accepted. The first Norman forces arrived in Ireland in 1169. They performed exactly as Diarmait needed them to. Their military technology was unlike anything the Irish kings had encountered. Armoured knights, disciplined archers, the tactical coordination of professional soldiers trained in the Norman tradition. The advantage they carried was not a matter of courage or numbers. It was a matter of system, and system was decisive. Wexford fell. Diarmait consolidated Leinster. In 1170, Strongbow arrived with a larger force, took Waterford, married Aoife, and moved on Dublin. Dublin, in 1170, was still substantially a Hiberno-Norse city, its population retaining Norse cultural character, its commercial networks extending across the Irish Sea. Its defences were those of a trading city, not a military fortress built to resist coordinated assault. The city fell, and the way it fell is instructive. The defenders attempted to negotiate rather than fight, sending representatives to parley. While talks were underway, a group of Norman knights attacked a section of the walls and breached the defences before any agreement could be reached. Those who could escape did so by ship. Those who remained submitted. The willingness to attack during negotiation was not an accident of impatience. It was characteristic. The Normans operated according to a military culture that treated the moment of apparent ceasefire as an opportunity rather than an obligation. Opponents accustomed to different rules about how conflict was conducted found this repeatedly surprising. It should not have remained surprising for long. Diarmait mac Murchada died in 1171. Having recovered his kingdom and set in motion forces whose full consequences he did not live to see. Assigning him simple blame for what followed is a form of historical unfairness. He made a decision in a specific political crisis, using the tools available to him. That is how most of history's catastrophes actually begin. Not with monsters. With people making comprehensible choices in circumstances they do not fully understand. Henry II of England arrived in Ireland in 1171. Not from enthusiasm for Irish conquest, but from anxiety about Strongbow. A powerful vassal who had acquired a kingdom of his own was exactly the development that English kings needed to manage before it became unmanageable. Henry came to ensure that whatever the Normans had acquired would be acquired in his name, under his authority, subject to his law. He brought it off. Strongbow acknowledged his lordship. Irish kings came to make their submissions. Dublin had a new master, and for the first time, Dublin had a formal institutional relationship with the English crown that would define its politics for the next 7.5 centuries. Dublin Castle, construction of which began in 1204 under King John, according to a letter of that year that survives in the historical record, was the physical expression of that relationship. Built at the southeastern corner of the old city walls, commanding the approaches, visible from a distance, announcing in the language that stone speaks that something had permanently changed. What followed almost immediately was a paradox that would recur throughout the medieval period. The Norman lords who had come as agents of English power were not immune to the country they had conquered. Over generations, the Anglo-Norman families granted Irish lands began to adopt Irish customs, speak the Irish language, intermarry with Irish families. They became as the phrase of the time had it, more Irish than the Irish themselves. This was not ideology. It was adaptation. The Gaelic world around them was not a void. It was a functioning, sophisticated society with its own laws, its own literature, one of the oldest literary languages in Europe, with a poetic tradition of extraordinary depth. The Anglo-Norman settlers who moved toward that world were not surrendering to something lesser. They were recognizing something worth keeping. That recognition, repeated across generations in private choices about language and marriage and custom, was precisely what the colonial administration found most threatening. You can defend a border against armies. You cannot easily defend a cultural boundary against the accumulated weight of daily human contact. Dublin, in the Norman centuries, was becoming something that none of its founders had designed. A city built by Vikings, reshaped by Normans, and slowly, stubbornly, insistently pulled back toward the Irish world it sat at the centre of. On a winter evening in Norman Dublin, you could stand on the quays and hear 3 languages in the space of a single hour. Irish from the merchants coming in from the countryside, Norse from the old Hiberno-Norse families still running their workshops along the waterfront, French from the administrators walking down from the castle. 3 worlds, 1 river, 1 city trying to hold all of it together. That was what Dublin had become, and nobody yet knew what to do with it. Chapter 4. The Pale and the 2 Islands. To be beyond the pale. The phrase is in daily use in the English language right now, still meaning something unacceptable, something outside the boundaries of civilized behavior. Most of the people using it today have no idea it comes from Ireland. It comes from a line drawn in Irish soil by a colonial administration that was losing its grip and knew it, and from the desperate attempt to hold that line against the most subversive force the English presence in Ireland ever faced. That force was not an Irish army. It was ordinary human life. By the 14th century, the Norman project in Ireland was in serious trouble. And the trouble was not primarily military. The military challenges were real. The Bruce invasion of 1315 to 1318, when Edward Bruce of Scotland landed in Ireland with a substantial force and attracted significant Irish support in a campaign against English rule, exposed with painful clarity how fragile the colonial position actually was. Bruce was defeated and killed at the Battle of Forhart in 1318, but 3 years of his campaign had devastated wide areas of Ireland and shown the limits of what the English administration could defend. The deeper problem was cultural, and it had been growing for generations. The Anglo-Norman families settled on Irish lands had been doing what human beings do when they live somewhere long enough. They had been becoming part of it. The Fitzgeralds, the Butlers, the Roches, the Burkes, families whose ancestors had arrived as agents of English colonization, had developed deep roots in Irish soil across 3 or 4 generations. They spoke Irish. They patronized Irish poets and musicians. They followed Brehon law, the ancient Gaelic legal system, in their private dealings. They intermarried with Irish noble families. They gave their children Irish names. Walk into a great Anglo-Norman hall in the Irish countryside in the mid-14th century, and you might hear Irish spoken at the table, see Irish dress on the people seated there, and hear Irish poetry performed for an Anglo-Norman lord who understood every word and had paid the poet himself. The servants moving through the rushes on the floor, the hounds lying by the fire, the harper in the corner, all of it Gaelic, all of it belonging to a world the original Norman settlers had come to govern and had instead been absorbed by. This was not exceptional. It was ordinary, and it was precisely what terrified Dublin Castle. The Statutes of Kilkenny, passed in 1366 under the direction of Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, were the most comprehensive attempt in the medieval period to legislate the boundary between English and Irish. The statutes prohibited English settlers from speaking Irish, from adopting Irish customs of dress, from following Irish law in their legal disputes, from intermarrying with Irish people, from patronizing Irish poets and storytellers. Read them today, and what strikes you most is not the harshness of the prohibitions, but the desperation that produced them. These were not the confident laws of a dominant power setting terms for a subordinate population. They were the panicked response of an administration watching its own people disappear into the country they were supposed to be governing. The English were not being repelled by Irish military force. They were being absorbed by Irish culture, and absorption, from the perspective of colonial authority, was more threatening than any battle. The laws did not work. They could not work, because the conditions producing cultural mixing were not conditions that legislation could change. People lived next to each other. They traded. They needed each other. They fell in love. The Irish language was the language of daily life across most of the country, and an English settler who refused to learn it was simply an ineffective settler. Practical pressures pushed continuously against legal ones. They always do. What the statutes accomplished, with unintended clarity, was the formal articulation of something that had been developing informally for 2 centuries. Ireland was now officially divided into 2 worlds. The English world, governed by English law, administered from Dublin, oriented toward the Crown in London, and the Irish world, governed by Brehon law, organised around Gaelic kinship structures, speaking a language the official administration classified as alien. The physical expression of that division became, over the course of the 15th century, what was known as the Pale. The term referred to the area of Ireland in which English law and English administration actually functioned with some reliability. At its most extensive, it covered a substantial portion of the eastern seaboard, including Dublin and surrounding counties. At its most contracted, as English power weakened through the 15th century, it shrank to a much smaller area centred on the city itself, in some sections reinforced by actual earthwork defences, marking the literal boundary between administered territory and what lay beyond the Pale, entirely concrete before it became metaphorical. But here is the irony the phrase has carried, largely unrecognised, into modern language. The world beyond the Pale was not chaos. It was a different order, Brehon law. The legal system of Gaelic Ireland was extraordinarily sophisticated, with centuries of jurisprudential development covering everything from land tenure to personal injury to the rights of poets and the obligations of kings. The world the English administration classified as barbarous and disordered was, by its own standards, neither. Dublin in this period was the capital of a shrinking enclave in an island that had largely refused to be colonised on English terms. The city retained its character as a centre of English administration and commerce. Its castle, its cathedrals, its merchant quarter, its legal institutions all continued to function as expressions of the colonial project. But the Irish world pressed constantly against the boundaries of that project, not through organised military campaign, but through the slow, irresistible pressure of demographic reality and cultural vitality. The 15th century produced a phenomenon further complicating the picture. The great Anglo-Irish magnate families had by this period become so powerful that they effectively governed Ireland, whether the English crown approved or not. The Fitzgerald Earls of Kildare accumulated a degree of power, making them the effective rulers of the island through much of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The 8th Earl, Garrett Moore Fitzgerald, known as the Great Earl, governed Ireland for most of the period between 1477 and 1513, with a combination of military force, political skill, and personal authority that the English crown found both useful and alarming. The Kildare Fitzgeralds were Anglo-Irish, which is to say, neither simply English nor simply Irish, but something produced by 2 centuries of intersection between those worlds. They spoke both languages. They operated in both legal systems. They commanded loyalty from English settlers and Gaelic Irish chieftains alike. They were, in their own persons, the living refutation of the distinction the statutes of Kilkenny had tried to enforce. The English crown's relationship with the Great Earl was one of grudging dependence. Ireland could not be governed without him. Ireland could not be trusted to be governed by him. That paradox would define the relationship between the English crown and its most powerful Irish subjects for the next several generations. The pale that defined Dublin's relationship to Ireland in the 15th century was not only a line on the landscape, it was a line in the mind, a way of dividing the world into the known and the other, the ordered and the unruly, the self and the stranger. That line, drawn first in the mud of the medieval Irish countryside, would be redrawn many times in the centuries to come. In legal codes and plantation maps and penal statutes and partition treaties, it was never enough. It was never going to be enough. The line kept dissolving the moment the people on either side of it remembered they were neighbours. Chapter 5. Reformation, Rebellion, and the Tudor Hammer. On a morning in 1534, a young Anglo-Irish lord named Thomas Fitzgerald rode into a meeting of the Irish Council in Dublin, threw down the sword of state that symbolised his father's position as Lord Deputy, and declared himself in open rebellion against the English crown. He was 21 years old. His followers wore silk fringe on their helmets. History gave him a nickname that has outlasted almost everything else about him: Silken Thomas. The rebellion was crushed within 2 years. Thomas was executed at Tyburn in 1537, along with 5 of his uncles, effectively ending the Kildare dynasty as a political force. But the rebellion matters not for what it achieved, which was nothing, but for what it triggered. The destruction of the Kildars removed the one family that had made Ireland governable on behalf of the English crown without requiring a permanent, expensive English military presence. With that buffer gone, the Tudor monarchy faced a choice it had been avoiding for generations: govern Ireland directly, with English officials and English soldiers and English money, or accept that Ireland would remain a partially governed, partially English, partially Gaelic place that could always become a problem. Henry VIII chose to govern it directly. The consequences shaped Ireland for the next 4 centuries. The formal declaration of the Kingdom of Ireland in 1542, by which Henry upgraded his title from Lord of Ireland to King of Ireland, was more than a change of title. It was a statement of intent. The intermediary model was over. Ireland was now, formally and completely, an English possession subject to the full apparatus of English governance. That apparatus included, fatally, the English Reformation. Henry's break with Rome had produced a Church of England that was doctrinally Protestant, structurally controlled by the Crown, and committed to dismantling the Catholic ecclesiastical framework that had organised Christian life for centuries. In England, that process was contested but ultimately successful. In Ireland, it failed. And understanding why it failed is essential to understanding almost everything that followed. The Irish Church had its own character, shaped by centuries of relative independence from Rome and by deep integration with Gaelic social structures. The monasteries were not simply religious institutions in the narrow sense. They were cultural repositories, centres of learning, custodians of the language and literature of a civilization. To dissolve them was not a property transaction. It was an attack on the infrastructure of Irish cultural identity. Beyond the institutional question, the Reformation faced a problem it never solved. It was English. The Reformed Church, established in Ireland, was administered in English, conducted services in English, staffed primarily by men from England or aligned with the English colonial world. For the Gaelic-speaking majority, this was not a new form of Christianity. It was a foreign church, speaking a foreign language, serving a foreign power. The choice between the old faith and the new was inseparable from the choice between Irish identity and English domination. Most Irish people, given that choice, found it straightforward. The result was a religious division cutting across and deepening every other division in Irish society. The English colonial world became Protestant. The Gaelic Irish world remained Catholic. The church the reformers had tried to replace became, in the process of being persecuted, more deeply embedded in Irish identity than it had ever been before. The attempt to destroy it created something it had not previously been: the institutional backbone of Irish national consciousness. Dublin's two cathedrals, Christ Church and St. Patrick's, passed into Protestant hands. The monastic houses that had been part of the city's landscape for centuries were dissolved, their properties redistributed to loyal Protestant settlers. The physical shape of Dublin's religious life was transformed within a generation. For the tens of thousands of Catholic Dubliners who remained, the city's most prominent religious buildings were now administered by a church they did not recognise as their own. The military history of the Tudor period in Ireland is a catalogue of rebellion and repression whose scale was exceptional even by the standards of a brutal century. The Desmond rebellions of the 1560s and 70s were followed by a plantation policy, attempting to replace the rebellious population of large areas of Munster with loyal English Protestant settlers. Edmund Spenser, the English poet best known today for the Faerie Queene, served as a colonial administrator in Munster during the 1580s and acquired plantation land there. He also wrote A View of the Present State of Ireland, arguing in prose of clinical clarity for the complete military subjugation of Ireland as the only effective policy. Spenser was capable of extraordinary beauty in his verse, and capable, in the same lifetime, of writing about the starvation of the Irish population as a policy tool. Both things were true of the same person. That coexistence should unsettle anyone who imagines that literary sensibility and colonial brutality are naturally incompatible. The defining crisis of the Tudor period was the 9 Years' War, fought between 1593 and 1603. It came closer to ending English rule in Ireland than any previous rebellion. Its leaders were Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and Red Hugh O'Donnell, Ulster chieftains whose alliance produced a military force capable of defeating English armies in the field. Most dramatically at the Battle of the Yellow Ford in 1598, where an English force was destroyed in the most significant Irish military victory of the century. O'Neill was not a traditional Gaelic chieftain fighting in the old mode. He had spent years at the English court, absorbed English military knowledge, and used that knowledge to build an Irish army trained in contemporary European tactics. He sought and received Spanish military support, an intervention reflecting how completely the Irish conflict had become entangled with the larger European struggle between Catholic and Protestant powers. The Spanish support culminated in a landing at Kinsale in 1601. The battle fought there on the 24th of December, 1601 was a catastrophe for the Irish cause. O'Neill's forces were defeated. The campaign that had come closest to breaking English power in Ireland was over. What followed was a campaign of subjugation so systematic that contemporary observers, including men with no sympathy for the Irish cause, recorded what they saw with evident horror. Crops were burned, cattle were driven off. The population of Ulster experienced starvation on a scale leaving visible marks in the historical record. O'Neill submitted in 1603, just days after the death of Elizabeth I. Without knowing the monarch he had fought for 9 years was already dead. He was allowed to keep his title and much of his land, but his position was no longer what it had been. In 1607, O'Neill, Rory O'Donnell, and nearly 100 other Gaelic noblemen and their families boarded ships at Lough Swilly and sailed for the continent. The flight of the Earls. It was most likely a response to intelligence about imminent arrest, rather than the planned dramatic gesture that romantic tradition sometimes makes it. But its consequences were profound regardless of its immediate causes. The Gaelic aristocracy that had led resistance to Tudor conquest was gone. The vacuum was filled rapidly and deliberately by the Ulster plantation, which brought tens of thousands of Protestant settlers from Scotland and England into the province that had been the last stronghold of Gaelic resistance. Among those settlers were families whose descendants would eventually cross the Atlantic, carrying with them the memory of a plantation that had itself been built on displacement. That particular thread of history runs further than most people realize, connecting a decision made on the banks of Lough Swilly in 1607 to communities across America that still feel its pull today. The Tudor hammer had struck. The fracture it produced would never fully close. Chapter 6. Cromwell's Shadow and the Protestant Ascendancy. There is a name in Ireland that functions differently from other names in history. Most historical figures, however terrible their actions, are eventually discussed with analytical distance, weighed against their context, placed within the limitations of their time. This name has never fully received that treatment in Ireland, not even now. Nearly 4 centuries after the events it is associated with, it produces, in Irish conversation, a particular silence that is not emptiness, but the opposite of emptiness. The name is Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell arrived in Ireland in August of 1649 as commander of the parliamentary forces, 11 months after the execution of King Charles I, and 8 years into a conflict that had already consumed Ireland in ways the English Civil War, for all its violence, had not prepared anyone for. To understand what Cromwell did in Ireland, you need to understand what had already happened in the 8 years before he arrived. The rebellion that broke out in Ulster in October of 1641 began as an uprising by dispossessed Gaelic Irish Catholics against the Protestant settlers of the Ulster plantation, and it rapidly became something larger and more chaotic. Stories of massacre spread through Protestant communities, some accurate, many exaggerated in the retelling, but all feeding a terror that had genuine basis in the violence that had actually occurred. When Cromwell landed, Ireland was exhausted, divided, and marked by years of mutual atrocity on a scale that had left few communities on the island untouched. His campaign lasted approximately 9 months, from 1649 to 1650. At Drogheda in September of 1649, Cromwell's forces stormed the town after its garrison refused to surrender and killed a substantial proportion of the military defenders along with some of the civilian population. At Wexford the following month, a similar pattern followed. The precise numbers remain disputed by historians, but the scale was sufficient to constitute what Cromwell himself described in his own written dispatches as a righteous judgment of God. These events need to be understood accurately rather than distorted in either direction. By the military conventions of the 17th century, a garrison refusing a formal offer of surrender could expect, if the town was taken by storm, to receive no quarter. That context does not make the deaths less terrible. It explains why Cromwell's contemporaries in England responded not with horror but with approval. That gap between how two audiences heard the same news is itself part of the story. What followed the military campaign was, in some ways, more consequential than the sieges themselves. The Act for the Settlement of Ireland of 1652 authorised the largest single confiscation of land in Irish history. Catholic landowners across the country were stripped of their properties. They were offered, as an alternative to execution, transplantation to Connacht, the westernmost and least productive province of Ireland. Go to hell or Connacht. The lands confiscated were redistributed to Cromwellian soldiers in lieu of pay and to investors who had financed the parliamentary war effort through the Adventurers Act. The result was a transfer of land ownership so complete that by its end, Catholic Irish ownership of land in Ireland had fallen dramatically from its pre-rebellion levels. According to analyses drawing on the Down Survey of the 1650s, the most comprehensive land survey conducted in Ireland to that point. This was not ethnic cleansing in the modern legal definition of that term. It was something the 17th century had its own categories for, a systematic dispossession along religious and political lines, conducted through legal mechanisms, giving it the appearance of order while producing consequences indistinguishable from catastrophe for those who experience them. The Restoration of 1660 brought Charles II to the throne and changed Dublin's atmosphere overnight. The Puritan severity of the interregnum gave way to something more animated, more culturally alive. Commerce revived. Goods moved through the quays again in quantities they had not seen since before the wars. The sounds of a working city came back to streets that had been too quiet for too long. The Williamite War in Ireland, fought between 1689 and 1691, pitted Jacobite forces supporting the deposed Catholic King James II against Williamite forces supporting the Protestant William of Orange. The decisive engagement was the Battle of the Boyne on the 1st of July 1690, a date that has been commemorated, contested, and argued over in Irish and Northern Irish life ever since. William's forces crossed the Boyne and defeated James's army. James fled to France so quickly that his Irish supporters gave him a nickname capturing their feelings precisely: Seamus and Chaka, James the Shit. A people who had staked a great deal on his willingness to fight did not easily forgive his willingness to run. The Treaty of Limerick in 1691 formally ended the war on terms promising Catholics a degree of religious toleration and property rights. Those promises were broken almost immediately by the Irish Protestant Parliament, which over the following decades enacted the penal laws. Catholics were prohibited from voting, from holding public office, from practicing law, from bearing arms, from purchasing land, from inheriting land from Protestants, from maintaining Catholic schools, from sending their children abroad for education. The enforcement of these laws was never complete or consistent. Catholic religious practice continued throughout the period, but the cumulative effect was to confine the Catholic majority to legal and economic subordination, to create a system in which religious identity was the primary determinant of access to property, power, and opportunity. And then, in a paradox so complete it almost seems designed, Dublin began to be rebuilt. The city that emerged through the early and middle decades of the 18th century is the Dublin of Georgian streets and squares that still defines the historic core today. The Custom House, completed in 1791 to the designs of James Gandon, standing on the north bank of the Liffey with its dome catching the river light below. The Forecourts, also by Gandon, completed in the 1790s. Leinster House, built in the 1740s, which would eventually become the home of the Irish Parliament. Merrion Square, Fitzwilliam's Square, the Wide Streets Commission, established in 1757, systematically redesigned Dublin's street pattern, replacing medieval lanes with broad thoroughfares. By the middle of the 18th century, Dublin was among the largest cities in the British Isles, its population grown to well over 100,000 people. Walk along Fitzwilliam Street on a winter afternoon when the light is going and the brick is warm against the grey sky, and you will understand why people who love this city love it with an intensity that surprises even themselves. The proportions are right in a way that feels almost inevitable, but the beauty was paid for. The Ascendancy families who built those houses were the beneficiaries of a system that had stripped the Catholic majority of Ireland of land, of legal rights, of political voice, and of the economic capacity to participate in the wealth their country was generating. The Dublin that gleamed was a Protestant city. The people who built it, cleaned it, and carried its goods were overwhelmingly Catholic, living in conditions that the grand facades of the Ascendancy streets did not advertise. Jonathan Swift, the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral and author of Gulliver's Travels, was one of the few voices of the Protestant Ascendancy to write with any consistency about the condition of the Catholic poor. His pamphlet, A Modest Proposal, published in 1729, suggested with elaborate ironic politeness that the children of the Irish poor might be eaten as a solution to Irish poverty. It remains one of the most savage pieces of sustained irony in any language. The savagery was possible only because the conditions it described were real. Swift was not inventing the misery of the Catholic Irish poor. He was reflecting it back at the people who had created it in a form designed to be impossible to ignore. Whether it was possible to ignore it turned out, for many members of the Protestant Ascendancy, to be a considerably easier question than Swift had hoped. Two cities shared the same streets in 18th century Dublin. One built itself in brick and stone and commissioned portraits of itself and rode in carriages through the wide new streets. The other got up before dawn and kept the first city running and went home to the tenements forming behind the grand facades. Both cities were real. Only one of them was visible, and the one that was not visible was keeping a record of its own. Chapter 7. The Finest City in the Empire and the Act of Union. A visitor arriving in Dublin in the 1780s from anywhere in Europe would have encountered something unexpected. Not a provincial backwater, not a colonial outpost, but a capital city in the fullest sense of the term. Confident, prosperous, architecturally ambitious, and possessed of a political and intellectual life that could hold its own against any city in the British Isles. Dublin, in the 1780s, had a population of approximately 200,000 people, making it the second largest city in the British Isles after London, larger than Edinburgh, Bristol, and Manchester. Its new public buildings were among the finest examples of neoclassical architecture in Europe. Its professional and merchant classes had accumulated wealth sufficient to sustain a cultural life of genuine depth. Its theatres, coffee houses, learned societies, and legal institutions gave the city the texture of a place that took itself seriously and had reason to. The Parliament sitting on College Green was the most visible expression of Dublin's status as a real capital. The Irish Parliament had existed in various forms since the medieval period, but it had been constrained by Poyning's Law of 1494, which required all Irish legislation to be approved by the English Privy Council before it could be enacted, and by the Declaratory Act of 1720, which asserted the British Parliament's right to legislate directly for Ireland. The American Revolution changed this in ways that participants recognized as historically significant even as they lived through them. The American colonists had argued that taxation without representation was tyranny, Irish patriots applied the same logic immediately to their own situation. If American colonies could not legitimately be governed by a parliament excluding them, then Ireland could not either. The logic was identical. The implications were radical. Henry Grattan, the most gifted parliamentary orator of his generation in Ireland, led the campaign for legislative independence. The Irish Volunteers, a Protestant militia force originally formed to defend Ireland during the American War, provided the political pressure behind his parliamentary skill. In 1782, the combination produced what became known as Grattan's Constitution. Poyning's law was modified, the Declaratory Act was repealed, and the Irish Parliament gained a degree of legislative independence it had never previously possessed. The period that followed was the closest thing to genuine Irish self-government that Dublin had experienced since the Norman arrival. The question of Catholic emancipation, the removal of the penal law disabilities, became the central political issue of the period. Grattan himself supported it. He understood that a parliament claiming to represent Ireland while excluding the majority of the Irish population from political participation was making a claim that could not survive serious scrutiny. The 1790s brought to Ireland a generation of radicals shaped by the American and French revolutions, convinced that the distinctions dividing the Irish people were obstacles to overcome rather than facts to accommodate. The Society of United Irishmen, founded in Belfast in 1791, was the most important of these organisations. Its most famous figure, Theobald Wolfe, is one of the most genuinely unexpected characters in Irish history. Tone was a Dublin Protestant, a barrister by training, a man whose background placed him squarely in the ascendancy world. He was also a Republican in the full French revolutionary sense, committed to the idea that the distinction between Protestant and Catholic was an instrument of British rule in Ireland, deliberately maintained to prevent the Irish people from recognising their common interest and acting on it together. His formulation of Irish nationality, that the Irish nation comprised the whole people of Ireland, Catholic, Protestant, and dissenter, regardless of religious affiliation, was a revolutionary proposition in its own time. It is also, not coincidentally, the proposition that most Irish Americans understand themselves to be descended from, whatever the religious background of their particular ancestors. When Irish American families think about what Ireland means to them, they are, often without knowing it, thinking in the language that Theobald Wolfe gave them 200 years ago. The rebellion of 1798 was the most serious attempt to end British rule in Ireland between the flight of the Earls and the 20th century. It was also a catastrophe. The rebellion that broke out in May of 1798, centred primarily in Wexford and Ulster, was met with a military response of systematic brutality. The yeomanry forces deployed against the rebels conducted summary executions, torture, and the burning of communities on a scale that shocked even some who supported the suppression. The French assistance Tone had secured arrived too late and in insufficient force. Tone himself was captured at sea with a French fleet in October of 1798, tried by court-martial in Dublin and sentenced to death. He died in prison before the sentence could be carried out from a wound to the throat that may have been self-inflicted. He was 35 years old. The rebellion killed somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 people in Ireland, with estimates varying considerably across historical sources. Whatever the precise figure, the scale transformed the British government's political calculation fundamentally. The response was the Act of Union of 1800. Prime Minister William Pitt, the Younger, argued that the events of 1798 had demonstrated that an independent Irish Parliament could not reliably maintain the security of the connection between Britain and Ireland. Only direct integration into the British parliamentary system could provide the security the current situation could not. The passage of the Act of Union through the Irish Parliament in the summer of 1800 was accompanied by the creation of new peerages, compensation payments for the loss of parliamentary seats, and what historians have generally characterized as systematic use of political patronage to secure the votes needed. The Union was not passed by a parliament freely expressing the will of the Irish political nation. It was passed by a parliament that had been worked on, carefully and expensively, by an administration with considerable resources and a clear sense of what outcome it required. On the 1st of January 1801, the Act of Union came into force. The Parliament of Ireland ceased to exist. Its building on College Green was sold. Irish representatives took their seats at Westminster. Dublin, which had been the capital of a kingdom with its own legislature, became the administrative centre of a province managed from London. The impact was immediate. The aristocratic families and wealthy professionals who had maintained Dublin townhouses because Parliament required their presence in the city no longer had that reason to stay. The social and economic life clustering around the parliamentary season contracted sharply. The city that had been, for a generation, among the most elegant and intellectually vibrant in Europe, began a decline whose consequences would be visible in its physical fabric for the next century and more. The promise Pitt had made to accompany the Union, that Catholic emancipation would follow quickly as a measure to reconcile the Catholic majority to the new arrangement, was blocked by King George III, who believed with a conviction no argument could shift that granting political rights to Catholics would violate his coronation oath. Pitt resigned over the issue. Catholic emancipation did not come for nearly 30 more years. Dublin in the first decade of the 19th century was a city adjusting to diminishment. The great public buildings were still there. The Georgian streets still gleamed in the right light. The coffee houses were still open, still full of argument, still capable of producing a good sentence at midnight about the state of the country. But the energy that had animated the city in the 1780s and 90s had been drawn off to Westminster, along with the Parliament itself, a city that had experienced, within a single generation, both its greatest moment of political aspiration and its most complete political defeat, was left with a question it could not yet answer. How do you keep arguing for something when the room where the argument was supposed to happen has been closed and the key handed to someone else? Ireland would spend the next century finding out, and the answer, when it finally came, would surprise everyone, including the people who gave it. Chapter 8. Famine City. There is a set of sculptures on the north quays of the Liffey, not far from the custom house, that stops people in a way that few public monuments anywhere manage to stop them. The figures are bronze, life-sized, gaunt beyond what seems anatomically possible, their clothes hanging from bodies that appear to be disappearing inside them. They walk toward the river with a purposefulness that is also a kind of blankness, as if they have already left somewhere and have not yet arrived anywhere, and the distance between those two states is where they permanently exist. Children cling to adults. Adults stare forward. Nobody looks back. The sculptor Rowan Gillespie created them in 1997. They are called Famine. They stand on the quays because the quays were where the ships were. The ships were how you left, and leaving was, for more than 1 million people in the years between 1845 and 1852, the only alternative to dying. If you are among the more than 31 million Americans who claim Irish ancestry, there is a reasonable chance that someone in your family line stood on these quays, or on quays like them in Cork or Waterford or Sligo, and made a decision that produced, among its many consequences, you. That connection is not abstract. It is biological. It is the reason Irish America exists at the scale it does. And it begins here, in the worst years this city and this country have ever known. To understand the Great Famine in the context of Dublin's history, you need to understand first what Dublin was in 1845. It was the administrative capital of a country governed from London, the seat of the Lord Lieutenant representing the British Crown in Ireland, the location of Dublin Castle from which the apparatus of colonial administration operated. The city had fine buildings and a functioning commercial class and a port that moved goods in both directions across the Irish Sea. It also sat at the centre of an island whose rural population lived in conditions that contemporary observers from continental Europe consistently described with something close to disbelief. The rural poverty of pre-famine Ireland was not hidden. It was thoroughly documented, most comprehensively by government commissions conducted in the 1830s and early 1840s. The Devon Commission of 1845, reporting on conditions of Irish agricultural labourers just months before the blight arrived, found that the majority of the rural poor were living in conditions of destitution without parallel in any other part of the United Kingdom. A family in a one-room mud cabin, a pig sharing the floor, a diet consisting, for most of the year, almost entirely of potatoes, not as a staple food alongside other foods. As the food, the only food, the potato had made this precarious situation function, barely and temporarily, because it was extraordinarily productive per acre, nutritionally dense, and capable of sustaining a family on a very small plot of land. Ireland's rural population had grown substantially in the decades before the famine, reaching somewhere around 8 million people by the 1840s, according to the Census of Ireland of 1841, and a significant portion of that population depended on the potato as its primary food source, in a way that had no equivalent anywhere else in Europe. Then, in the late summer of 1845, a water mould called Phytophthora infestans arrived in Ireland, most likely carried on ships from North America, where it had already devastated potato crops. It moved through the Irish countryside with a speed that turned green fields to black rot in days. The potato crop of 1845 was partially destroyed. The crop of 1846 was almost entirely destroyed. The crop of 1848 failed again. For the people who depended on that crop to survive, the arithmetic was straightforward and terrible. What transformed a natural disaster into a catastrophe of historical proportions was the intersection of that natural disaster with the political and economic framework within which Ireland existed. Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, governed by the most powerful and prosperous nation on earth. The resources that could have been mobilized to prevent mass starvation were, in the abstract, available. The question historians have argued about ever since is why they were not mobilized at the scale the crisis required. The British government's initial response under Prime Minister Robert Peel included the importation of Indian corn from America and the establishment of public works schemes intended to provide the starving population with wages to buy food. These measures were insufficient and poorly designed, but they were at least responses to the emergency as an emergency. When the Whig government of Lord John Russell replaced Peel in 1846, the response shifted toward a doctrinaire application of free market principles. Charles Trevelyan, the senior Treasury official responsible for famine relief, held with genuine conviction that government intervention in the Irish food market would distort trade and undermine Irish character through dependence on outside help. He also recorded in writing that survives that the famine was a judgment of God on an indolent people, and that the interference of man with the designs of Providence would be presumptuous. Food exports from Ireland did decline substantially during the famine years, and historical analyses of this period, including work drawing on customs records and trade statistics from the 1840s, indicate that the volume exported was insufficient to have fed the entire starving population, even if redirected entirely. But the symbolic and political weight of the fact that any food left Ireland while people starved beside the roads was, for those who experienced it and for those who inherited its memory, not a matter of economic policy. It was a moral verdict on the relationship between Ireland and the government claiming to govern it. That verdict has not expired in the Irish or Irish-American imagination, and it should not be surprising that it has not. Dublin's experience of the famine was different from the experience of the rural west and south, where mortality was greatest. The city had food markets, a cash economy, a degree of commercial complexity that insulated its wealthier inhabitants from the immediate effects. But Dublin was also where starving people came, walking and crawling and being carried from the stricken countryside toward a city that seemed, from a distance, to offer something the fields no longer could. What they found was a city utterly unprepared for what arrived at its boundaries. The workhouses, established under the Irish Poor Law of 1838, had been designed to handle the ordinary poverty of a poor country, not the extraordinary destitution of a country whose food supply had collapsed. They were overwhelmed within months. By 1847, the year known in Irish memory as Black 47, the workhouses of Dublin were holding populations 3 and 4 times their intended capacity, with mortality rates that made the buildings almost indistinguishable from dying places. The records of admissions and deaths in the Dublin workhouses during 1847 are among the most difficult documents in Irish history to read, not because they are written with any emotional intensity, but because they are written without it, column after column of names, age, dates of admission, dates of death, in the careful hand of clerks doing their administrative duty while all around them a civilization was dissolving. A woman of 42, admitted November, died December. Cause fever, a child of 6, admitted November, died November. Cause debility. Next line, next line, next line. The quays were the other face of Dublin's famine experience. From the port, ships left carrying emigrants who had somehow accumulated the fare, or whose landlords had paid their passage because clearing a starving tenantry from an estate was, in the brutal arithmetic of the time, cheaper than feeding them. The ships carrying the poorest famine emigrants were often overcrowded, under-provisioned, and poorly maintained. They earned the name coffin ships not as a metaphor, but as an accurate description of the mortality rates they produced. The destinations were primarily North America. Quebec and the ports of the St. Lawrence received enormous numbers of famine emigrants. Many sick with typhus contracted in the overcrowded ships on the Atlantic crossing. Gros Isle, the quarantine station in the St. Lawrence, became in 1847 the site of one of the most concentrated episodes of mortality in the history of Irish emigration, with thousands dying in the ships, on the island, and in the fever sheds along the shore before they could reach the mainland. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore received the survivors, and in receiving them, received something that would profoundly shape American urban and political life for the next century and beyond. The Irish-American community that exists today is in its roots a famine community. The great wave of emigration between 1845 and 1852, in which well over 1 million people left Ireland according to estimates, drawing on passenger records and port statistics of the period, laid the demographic foundation for the Irish presence in American cities that would grow and consolidate through the second half of the 19th century. The Boston Irish, the New York Irish, the Chicago Irish, the Philadelphia Irish. These are communities whose character, whose politics, whose relationship to power and to memory were shaped by people who left Ireland with nothing and arrived in America carrying the accumulated grief of what they had left behind. That grief did not dissipate. It was transmitted across generations of Irish-American families. The memory of the famine was kept alive with an intensity that has no real parallel in the historical memory of other immigrant communities in America. It shaped a political consciousness suspicious of British power, committed to Irish independence, and willing to provide financial and moral support to the cause of Irish nationalism across the full length of the 19th and 20th centuries. The money that flowed from Irish America to support the various movements for Irish independence was famine money in the most precise sense. The accumulated savings of survivors and their descendants, directed toward an Ireland that they or their parents had been forced to leave. The Ireland that survived the famine was a fundamentally different country from the one that had entered it. The population of Ireland, which had stood at around 8 million in 1841, had fallen to around 6.5 million by 1851, a decline of approximately 1.5 million attributable to the combined effects of death and emigration. According to figures drawn from successive Irish census records, but the decline did not stop. It continued year after year, decade after decade, as the culture of emigration that the famine had established became self-reinforcing. The Ireland of 1900 had a population of roughly 4.5 million, less than half what it had been 60 years before. No other country in the developed world experienced anything comparable to this sustained demographic collapse in peacetime. The famine was not a single event. It was a before and an after. The world that existed before 1845 and the world that existed after 1852 were connected by language and geography and the residue of a shared culture, but separated by something that those who had lived through it could not always find words for. Those bronze figures on the quays still walk toward the river. They do not look back, because looking back was not something the people they represent could afford to do. They walked toward the ships, and they kept walking. What they carried with them, the grief and the anger and the stubborn refusal to let Ireland go even after Ireland had let them go, that is what built Irish America, and that is why, more than a century and a half later, 31 million Americans still know the word Dublin. Chapter 9. The Idea of Ireland. Dublin in the 1850s was a city in mourning for something it could not quite name. The Parliament was gone. The famine had hollowed out the countryside that fed and surrounded it. The great families whose patronage had built the Georgian city had largely departed. The energy that had animated the political and intellectual life of the 1780s and 90s seemed to have been drawn off along with everything else, leaving behind a beautiful shell and a population too exhausted by what had just happened to know immediately what to do next. What happened next took a generation to become visible, and another generation to become irresistible. It began, as cultural movements always begin, with a small number of people asking a question that most of their contemporaries had either stopped asking or had never thought to ask in the first place. The question was simple and impossibly difficult at the same time. What is Ireland? And who are the Irish? The Gaelic language, which had been the primary spoken language of the majority of the Irish population a century before, had been devastated by the famine and by a century of educational pressure that had preceded it. The national schools established in 1831 conducted their instruction in English, effectively removing Irish from the educational formation of a generation. The language was still spoken, primarily in the rural West, but its position was weakening rapidly and the people who spoke it were among the poorest and most marginalised in Irish society. A language associated primarily with poverty and disadvantage is a language under existential pressure. Whatever its literary heritage, the political tradition of Irish nationalism had also fractured. The constitutional nationalism of Daniel O'Connell, who had won Catholic emancipation in 1829 through mass political organisation and had come close to winning repeal of the Act of Union before his movement collapsed, had dominated Irish political life for a generation. O'Connell died in 1847 at the height of the famine, and the young islanders who attempted a rising in 1848 demonstrated with painful clarity the gap between romantic nationalist aspiration and actual political and military capacity. Into this landscape of cultural fragmentation and political exhaustion came the Fenians, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, known as the Fenians, from the name of the legendary warrior band of ancient Irish mythology, was founded simultaneously in Dublin and New York in 1858. That transatlantic founding was not accidental. It reflected from the very beginning the dual character of Irish nationalism as both an Irish and an Irish-American project. The organizational connection between Ireland and the diaspora in America, established in these years, would prove one of the most durable and consequential institutional relationships in Irish political history. The Fenian movement was committed to an independent Irish republic through armed revolution, and it drew its membership primarily from the urban working class and from the Irish-American communities shaped by famine emigration. The men who filled its ranks in the cities of Boston and New York and Philadelphia were the sons and daughters of people who had stood on the Dublin quays a decade earlier with nothing. They had not forgotten what they had left behind. They were not going to let their children forget either. The Fenian attempted rising in Ireland in 1867 was militarily inadequate, easily suppressed, its leaders arrested or forced into exile. But the Fenians accomplished something that their military failures might seem to make impossible. They established, in the minds of a generation of Irish people on both sides of the Atlantic, the proposition that the question of Irish independence was not closed, that the authority of the British government in Ireland was not legitimate, that the people who refused to accept that authority were not criminals but patriots. That proposition, kept alive through the decades, would eventually produce the events of 1916. But before the military tradition could find its moment, something else was happening in Dublin and across Ireland that would prove, in the long run, equally important. A culture was being rebuilt. The Gaelic Athletic Association, founded in 1884 in Thurles, County Tipperary, by Michael Cusack and others, was ostensibly an organisation for the promotion of Irish sports, hurling and Gaelic football primarily, games with roots in the ancient Gaelic world that had survived in various forms through centuries of colonial pressure. But the GAA was never simply a sporting organisation. It was a vehicle for the articulation of Irish cultural identity in opposition to the cultural dominance of English models. Its rule prohibiting members from playing or attending English games made explicit what was implicit in the entire project. This was not just about what sports you played. It was about who you were. Today, the GAA's Croke Park Stadium in Dublin holds more than 82,000 people and is among the largest stadiums in Europe. On All-Ireland final days, it fills completely, and the sound that comes out of it can be heard across the city. That institution traces a direct line back to a meeting in Thurles in 1884. Some ideas, it turns out, are worth protecting. The Gaelic League, founded in Dublin in 1893 by Douglas Hyde and Eoin MacNeill, took the cultural project further. The League was dedicated to the preservation and revival of the Irish language, and it approached that mission with an energy and organisational sophistication that previous efforts had not achieved. It established classes across the country and in Irish communities abroad. It published materials in Irish. It organised festivals celebrating Irish music, dance, and literature. It created, for the first time, a mass organisational framework for the promotion of Irish culture that crossed class and, initially, political lines. Hyde himself was a Protestant from Connacht, a scholar whose genuine love for the language and its literature was evident in everything he wrote. His lecture of 1892, The Necessity for De-Anglicising Ireland, delivered to the National Literary Society in Dublin, argued passionately that the survival of Irish identity required the recovery of cultural distinctiveness that centuries of English influence had eroded. Hyde believed the cultural project could transcend political divisions and create a shared Irish identity, including people of all religious and political backgrounds. He was partly right and partly wrong, in ways the subsequent history of Ireland would make clear. To insist that Ireland had a distinct culture, a distinct language, a distinct literary and artistic tradition, was to insist that Ireland was a distinct nation. And to insist that Ireland was a distinct nation was to raise a question that had only one politically consequential answer. William Butler Yeats understood this with a clarity that his later discomfort with the political consequences of the cultural revival does not diminish. Yeats was the central figure of the Irish literary revival, a movement running parallel to and intertwined with the Gaelic revival without being identical to it. Where the Gaelic League focused on the Irish language and its traditions, the literary revival that Yeats led operated primarily in English, drawing on Irish mythology, landscape, and folk tradition to create a literature that was recognisably and assertively Irish, without requiring its reader to speak Irish to access it. The Abbey Theatre, founded in Dublin in 1904 by Yeats and Lady Augusta Gregory, was the institutional expression of this project, a theatre dedicated to the performance of Irish plays by Irish writers. It became, within a few years of its founding, one of the most artistically significant and politically contested theatres in the world. John Millington Synge's The Playboy of the Western World provoked riots on its opening night in 1907, when Dublin audiences responded to what they perceived as an insult to Irish womanhood with a violence that Yeats, standing on stage to defend his theatre, met with magnificent aristocratic contempt. People do not riot about things that do not matter. The riots at the Abbey were a measure of how seriously the project of Irish cultural self-definition was being taken, and how much was felt to be at stake. But Dublin, in the years between the famine and the rising, was not only a city of cultural revival and literary ambition, it was also a city of extraordinary poverty. And that poverty was not unconnected to the colonial relationship. The cultural revival was challenging. By 1913, Dublin had one of the highest infant mortality rates and one of the highest tuberculosis death rates of any city in Europe. According to the public health records of the period and the report of the Dublin Housing Inquiry of 1914, approximately 1/3 of the city's population lived in single-room tenement accommodation, in buildings that health inspectors consistently classified as unfit for human habitation. The families living in these conditions were not the subjects of cultural revival or parliamentary debate. They were the people who emptied the bins and laid the cobblestones and loaded the ships at the quays. James Larkin arrived in Dublin in 1907 as a trade union organiser, and what he found transformed him from a union official into something closer to a prophet. His anger at the conditions of the Dublin working poor was not a political performance. It was a genuine moral response to what he saw around him. He founded the Irish Transport and General Workers' Union in 1909 and built it into the most significant labour organisation in Irish history. James Connolly, who would become Larkin's most important colleague and who would die before a British firing squad after the Easter Rising, brought to the labour movement a theoretical depth complementing Larkin's emotional power. Connolly argued that the national question and the labour question were not separate. An Ireland that merely replaced British rulers with Irish capitalists had not achieved genuine liberation. The liberation of Ireland required the liberation of its working class as a necessary condition, not a subsequent consideration. The Dublin lockout of 1913 was the decisive confrontation of this period. William Martin Murphy, the most powerful employer in Dublin, refused to employ members of Larkin's union and organised the Dublin Employers' Federation to lock out any worker who would not sign a pledge to leave it. At the height of the lockout, approximately 20,000 workers were locked out of employment, and their families, according to contemporary labour movement records, were dependent on the strike fund and food kitchens the union organised to survive. The lockout ended inconclusively in early 1914, the workers returning on terms that did not include union recognition. In the narrow sense, it was a defeat, but it produced a hardening of consciousness in the Dublin working class, and from Connolly's organising in its aftermath, the Irish Citizen Army, a small workers' defence force that would eventually merge into the alliance planning the Easter Rising. Dublin in 1913 was holding multiple realities simultaneously. The cultural revival was producing some of the finest literature in the English language. The labour movement was forcing a confrontation with economic conditions the colonial relationship had created. The Irish Republican Brotherhood was planning, patiently and secretly, an armed rising, and the constitutional nationalist movement under John Redmond had come closer than any previous generation to achieving Home Rule through parliamentary means, with a Home Rule Bill passing the House of Commons in 1912, only to be suspended at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. The war reshuffled every political calculation in Ireland with a violence and speed nobody had anticipated. Redmond's decision to encourage Irishmen to enlist in the British Army split the Irish volunteers into a large majority that followed him and a small minority that refused. The minority that refused would form the military backbone of the Easter Rising. Dublin in the autumn of 1915 was a city that looked, on the surface, like a city waiting. Trams ran on their routes, pubs opened and closed, the theatres performed, the newspapers published, but in back rooms and in the reading rooms of the Gaelic League and in the conversations of men who had decided that waiting was no longer something they were willing to do, the fire was already being laid. The question was only when someone would strike the match. Chapter 10. Easter, Fire, and the Republic. The General Post Office on O'Connell Street is a neoclassical structure of considerable dignity. Its facade of Portland stone supported by 6 Ionic columns, its pediment bearing figures of Hibernia, Mercury, and Fidelity carved in stone. On any given day it functions as a post office. People queue at its counters to send parcels. They buy stamps. They check their phones while they wait. But the columns still bear the marks of rifle fire from a week in April 1916. More than a century later, Dublin has never tried very hard to remove them. They are not embarrassments. They are evidence. On Easter Monday, the 24th of April, 1916, approximately 1,200 men and women, drawn from the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army, occupied the GPO and a number of strategic buildings across Dublin and proclaimed the establishment of an Irish Republic. Patrick Pearse stood on the steps of the GPO and read aloud the proclamation of the Irish Republic, a document declaring in the name of God and of the dead generations from which Ireland received its old tradition of nationhood, that Ireland was a sovereign independent state. The military position of the rebels was, from the first hour, untenable. The rising had been planned for a larger force and was seriously compromised before it began. Eoin mac Neil, nominal commander of the Irish Volunteers, had issued a countermanding order on the Sunday before Easter when he learned that the German ship Ord, carrying arms for the rising, had been intercepted by the British Navy and scuttled by its captain. Mac Neil believed, with considerable military logic, that a rising without those arms was suicidal. His countermanding order reduced the forces available to Perce and Connolly to a fraction of what had been planned. Perce knew this and proceeded anyway. His reasoning, documented in the writings he had produced in the years before the rising, was that the military outcome was not the primary consideration. The proclamation of the Republic, the act of resistance itself, the willingness of Irish men and women to die for independence. These were what mattered. History would do the rest. The British military response, after an initial period of confusion, was overwhelming. Gunboats on the Liffey shelled central Dublin. Artillery reduced the rebel strongholds systematically. By Thursday of Easter week, much of the area around O'Connell Street was in flames. The GPO itself caught fire on Friday. Perce gave the order to evacuate on Saturday, the 29th of April, after 6 days of fighting that killed somewhere between 450 and 500 people, including civilians, rebel fighters, and British soldiers, according to records compiled by historians drawing on military and hospital records of the period. Perce surrendered unconditionally. The immediate public reaction in Dublin was not what the leaders of the rising had hoped for. The city had been physically damaged and disrupted. Civilians had been killed. The crowds that watched the rebel leaders being marched through the streets under armed guard were not cheering. Some were hostile. The revolutionary vanguard had not, in the first instance, awakened the popular consciousness that Perce had theorized about. Then the British government made the decision that transformed everything. The leaders of the rising were tried by courts-martial, in proceedings conducted in secret, without public representation, and sentenced to death. Between the 3rd and 12th of May, 1916, 15 men were executed by firing squad at Kilmainham Gaol in Dublin. Patrick Pearse was the first. James Connolly, wounded during the fighting and unable to stand, was shot tied to a chair. Further executions followed elsewhere, bringing the total number put to death for their role in the rising to 16. But it was the Kilmainham executions, conducted in the early mornings over those 9 days, that transformed the public mood. The executions were, from a purely military standpoint, understandable responses to an armed rebellion in the middle of a world war. They were, from a political standpoint, catastrophic errors of the first order. Each execution shifted Irish public opinion in ways that the British administration, absorbed in the larger crisis of the war in Europe, does not appear to have anticipated. The men who had been marched through hostile crowds 10 days earlier were becoming martyrs in real time. The transformation of public mood was visible and rapid. John Dillon, the constitutional nationalist MP, stood in the House of Commons and warned the British government that it was destroying the constitutionalist Irish politics it needed. "You are washing out our whole life's work," he told Prime Minister Herbert Asquith. "A nation is building up on those graves." He was right. The general election of December 1918 produced a result, ending the constitutional nationalist dominance of Irish politics that had persisted since the time of Daniel O'Connell. Sinn Féin won 73 of the 105 Irish seats at Westminster. Rather than taking those seats in London, the elected members assembled in Dublin in January 1919 and constituted themselves as Dáil Éireann, the Parliament of Ireland, ratifying the Republic proclaimed in 1916 and declaring independence from British rule. On the same day, members of the Irish Volunteers shot and killed 2 members of the Royal Irish Constabulary at Solohead Beg in County Tipperary. It was not a coordinated action with the political event taking place in Dublin, but it marked the beginning of the War of Independence, the guerrilla campaign that the IRA would wage against British forces for the next 2.5 years. Michael Collins, the IRA's Director of Intelligence, organised a network that systematically eliminated British intelligence agents in Ireland, most dramatically on Bloody Sunday, the 21st of November, 1920, when IRA units simultaneously killed 14 British intelligence officers in their homes and lodgings across Dublin in the early morning. Later that day, British forces opened fire on a crowd at a Gaelic football match in Croke Park, killing 14 civilians, including one of the players on the field. The Black and Tans, a hastily recruited auxiliary force deployed by the British government to support the Royal Irish Constabulary, acquired a reputation for indiscriminate violence against the civilian population that the historical record supports. The burning of Cork city centre by Crown forces in December 1920 was the most dramatic single episode. But it was not isolated. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921 ended the War of Independence and established the Irish Free State as a self-governing dominion within the British Empire rather than the fully independent Republic 1916 had proclaimed. It also provided for the partition of Ireland, with 6 counties of Ulster remaining part of the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. The treaty split the Republican movement with a bitterness that no subsequent generation has entirely healed. Those who supported it, led by Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith, argued it was the best achievable outcome, a stepping stone toward full independence. Collins reportedly told a colleague after signing the treaty that he had signed his own death warrant. Those who opposed it, led by Eamon de Valera, argued it betrayed the Republic, proclaimed in 1916, and accepted a partition that could not be morally justified. The Irish Civil War that followed, fought from June 1922 to May 1923, killed more Irish people than the War of Independence had. Casualty estimates from historians drawing on military archives suggest somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 people died, a figure exceeding the approximately 500 Irish fatalities of the War of Independence. It is the least discussed major event in Irish revolutionary history, partly because its wounds cut across the families and communities that had fought together against the British, and partly because those wounds have never fully healed. Collins himself was killed in an ambush at Beal na Blath in County Cork in August 1922. He was 31 years old. His death removed from the Free State leadership the one person who might have had the combination of Republican credibility and practical political intelligence to begin reconciliation before it hardened into the factional divisions that would shape Irish party politics for the rest of the century. Dublin emerged from the Civil War as the capital of a new state that was physically scarred and politically exhausted. The 4 courts had been partially destroyed, its public record office burning with the loss of irreplaceable archives reaching back centuries. The Custom House had been gutted. O'Connell Street was damaged again. The city that had been dreaming of independence for a century had it now. The columns of the GPO still bore the marks of the week that had made it possible. They still do. And every morning, people walk past them on their way to buy stamps. And some of them look up, and some of them do not. And both responses are, in their own way. Dublin. Chapter 11. The Long Silence. Independence, when it finally came, turned out to be a more complicated gift than anyone had imagined. The Ireland of the 1920s and 30s was a country that had won the argument and was now faced with the harder work of governing itself, with the institutions it had, with the divisions it carried, and with an economy that had not waited for the political question to be resolved before developing problems of its own. Walk through the centre of Dublin on a weekday morning in the 1950s, and what you encounter is a city that has arrived somewhere without being entirely sure how it got there or what it is supposed to do next. The Georgian streets are still there, still beautiful in the right light, but the energy has not returned. The windows of empty Georgian townhouses reflect a grey sky. A bus passes. A woman pushes a pram. A man reads a newspaper outside a tobacconist and does not look up. What is marked, more than anything else, is absence. The emigration that was supposed to end when Ireland gained the freedom to govern its own affairs had not ended. It had continued, year after year, driven now not by starvation, but by the impossibility of making a living in an economy that had not developed the capacity to employ its own people. The two main parties dominating Irish political life, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, the Party de Valera, founded in 1926, were not divided primarily by ideology or economic policy. They were divided by their position on the Treaty of 1921. The most important fault line in Irish democratic politics for most of the 20th century was a disagreement about an event that had happened before most voters were born. That tells you something important about how deep the Civil War had cut. De Valera's constitution of 1937 reflected his vision of Ireland with a completeness that tells you a great deal about what that vision was. The document established Ireland as a sovereign democratic state, acknowledged the special position of the Catholic Church in Irish society in terms giving church social teaching a constitutional status in Irish law, defined the family in terms reflecting Catholic teaching on marriage and divorce, and described the role of women in terms making the home their primary domain. The territory of the state was defined as the whole island of Ireland, an aspiration toward unity with Northern Ireland, meaningful as a statement of principle and meaningless as a description of reality. The relationship between the Irish state and the Catholic Church in the middle decades of the 20th century was not simple clerical domination of a passive government. It was a more complex entanglement of mutual interest and mutual reinforcement, in which a church that had been the primary institution of Irish cultural life for centuries found in the new state a government willing to formalize that institutional role, and a government that found in the church an organizational infrastructure and a moral authority it had not yet built for itself. The practical consequences were felt most acutely by those least able to resist them. The industrial schools, run by religious orders under state funding and supposedly providing care for orphaned and troubled children, became, over the decades, places of systematic physical and emotional abuse. Their full horror was not publicly documented until the Ryan Report of 2009, a government commission report drawing on testimony from thousands of survivors. The Magdalene laundries, institutions in which women who had transgressed Catholic sexual morality were held in conditions of forced labor, operated until 1996. The mother and baby homes, in which unmarried mothers were confined and their children separated from them, are the subject of the final report of the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes, published in 2021, whose findings regarding infant mortality rates in these institutions are among the most disturbing in recent Irish public history. These were not medieval institutions. They operated in the 20th century, in a state claiming democratic legitimacy and a church claiming moral authority. The gap between those claims and the reality of what happened inside those buildings is one of the defining moral facts of modern Irish history. The literary life of Dublin in these decades was shaped largely by what was not there rather than what was. The Censorship Board, established in 1929, had, by the 1950s, produced a list of banned books functioning as an inadvertent index of the most significant Irish literary achievement of the century. Samuel Beckett, banned. Sean O'Casey, effectively exiled. Edna O'Brien, whose first novel The Country Girls was banned in 1960. Copies burned by her local priest in her home parish in County Clare. The island that had fought for the freedom to express its own culture was censoring the writers who expressed it most honestly. That particular contradiction sat in Dublin like a stone in a shoe, obvious to everyone who wore it and mentioned by almost nobody. The 1950s were the low point. Emigration figures for that decade were the highest since the famine years. The economic policy of the protectionist era had failed to generate sufficient employment. Housing in the inner city remained a crisis. The tenement conditions of the early century having been partially addressed by public housing schemes that moved some of the worst poverty to the outer suburbs without resolving the conditions producing it. What changed the trajectory was a shift in economic policy as significant as anything that had happened politically since the treaty. T.K. Whitaker, Secretary of the Department of Finance, produced a document in 1958 called Economic Development, a program for opening the Irish economy to foreign investment, abandoning protectionism, and orienting policy toward growth. Sean Lemmas, who became Taoiseach in 1959, implemented it. The results were not immediate, but by the middle of the 1960s, Ireland's growth rate had improved substantially, and the worst of the emigration tide had turned. Dublin changed with it. The 1960s brought the combination of demolition and construction that modernisation always brings. And in Dublin's case, the demolition was sometimes catastrophic. Whole Georgian streets were cleared for office blocks and car parks. The destruction of Fitzwilliam Street's Georgian Terrace, one of the longest unbroken runs of Georgian architecture in Europe, to make way for offices for the Electricity Supply Board, remains one of the most lamented planning decisions in the city's history. The people who made that decision were not villains. They were people who had spent their lives in a country that could not afford its own past and did not yet know what its future was worth. The troubles that erupted in Northern Ireland from 1969 onward reverberated through Dublin directly. On the 17th of May, 1974, car bombs planted by loyalist paramilitaries exploded on Parnell Street, Talbot Street, and South Leinster Street in Dublin, killing 26 people in what remains the deadliest single day of violence in the history of the Irish state. The Dublin and Monaghan bombings killed more people in one afternoon than any single event of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The failure of subsequent investigations to establish with certainty who authorized the attacks has been a source of grief and anger for the families of the victims ever since. The Catholic Church's grip on Irish public life began to loosen in the 70s and 80s under the pressure of social change, economic development, and the first emerging accounts of abuse within church institutions. The 1980s were also years of economic crisis, unemployment above 15%, a new wave of emigration taking a generation of young Irish people to London, Boston, and New York, this generation's version of the departure that every Irish generation before them had made. Dublin in 1990 was a city that had been independent for nearly 70 years and had not yet found its economic footing, beautiful in certain lights, capable of producing extraordinary work in its theatres and its music and its writing, carrying the weight of an institutional framework that was beginning, visibly and painfully, to crack under the weight of what it had done and what it had hidden. But something was shifting underneath the surface of the city that the surface itself had not yet caught up with. A generation was coming of age that had not lived through the Civil War, had not been formed entirely by the Church, had not accepted that emigration was simply what Irish people did. They were still in Dublin. They were starting to ask different questions, and the answers they were about to receive would change everything so fast that the city would barely recognize itself a decade later. Chapter 12. The Celtic Tiger and the Crash. Take any photograph of Dublin's skyline from the early 2000s and count the construction cranes. There is always another one, behind the Georgian rooflines, above the Victorian spires, rising over every quarter and every suburb and every road leading out of the centre. The yellow latticed arms of construction equipment defined what the city looked like for nearly a decade. Dublin was building itself as fast as it could. It could not build fast enough, and the speed itself was a signal that deserved more scrutiny than it received. The transformation that produced those cranes had begun quietly in the late 1980s, driven by a combination of policy decisions whose full consequences nobody anticipated. The low corporate tax rate maintained since the Whittaker era attracted American technology companies restructuring for European operations. European Union structural funds invested in Irish infrastructure at a scale the domestic economy could never have managed alone. An educated, English-speaking, young workforce was available at competitive wages, and the companies that were remaking the global economy in the 1990s needed a European base. They chose Dublin. Intel had established a facility in Leixlip in 1989. Microsoft had its European headquarters outside the city. Then came Dell, Apple, Google, in later years, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. If you have ever used any of those products, there is a reasonable chance that some part of the infrastructure behind them was built, managed, or processed in a building on the outskirts of a city on the western edge of Europe that 2 generations earlier had been exporting its young people to build infrastructure for everyone else. The numbers were real. Between 1993 and 2007, the Irish economy grew at rates, making it one of the fastest growing in the developed world during that period. According to data from the Central Statistics Office of Ireland and comparative analyses by European economic institutions, unemployment fell to 4% by the early 2000s. The emigration that had defined Irish demographic history since the famine reversed. People came to Ireland, not just returning Irish emigrants, though there were many, but people from Poland and Lithuania and Nigeria and Brazil and China, arriving in a country that had spent centuries exporting its people and was now, for the first time in its modern history, importing them. Dublin absorbed all of this with a mixture of delight, bewilderment, and a particular Irish tendency to distrust good fortune that turned out, in this case, to have been well-founded. The city changed physically in ways dramatic and not always coherent. The Docklands area east of the city centre, a wasteland of derelict industrial land since containerization had made the old port facilities obsolete, was developed into the International Financial Services Centre. Temple Bar, the area of narrow streets south of the Liffey that had survived decades of development pressure through a combination of accident and activist opposition, was repurposed as a cultural quarter, its cobblestones and Georgian doorways becoming among the most photographed corners of the city. The suburbs expanded in every direction at a pace the planning system, overwhelmed and in some cases compromised, could not manage coherently. The prosperity was real. In the pubs and restaurants of a city that now had pubs and restaurants worth discussing, in the new shops and cultural institutions and expanding universities in the simple daily fact of young Irish people staying rather than leaving. The Celtic Tiger felt like a genuine transformation. The island that had exported its people for 150 years was keeping them. The psychological shift accompanying the economic one was profound, especially for people who had grown up in the lean Ireland of the 70s and 80s. But underneath the prosperity, the foundations were not all equally solid. The technology companies triggering the initial phase of growth were genuinely productive enterprises, creating real value. The problem was what happened when the prosperity of that boom interacted with a banking system that had not developed the regulatory framework to manage what came next. Property prices in Dublin had been rising since the early 1990s. Driven initially by genuine demand from a growing population with rising incomes. Through the late 90s and into the 2000s, something changed in the character of the property market that the available evidence suggests was not adequately understood by the people whose job it was to understand it. Banks began lending at multiples of borrower income that would have been considered reckless in any previous era. Developers borrowed at scales, assuming continuous price appreciation indefinitely. The regulatory bodies whose function was to monitor these developments were, in the assessment of subsequent official inquiries, including the Nyberg Report of 2011 and the Honohan Report of 2010, inadequate to the task either through insufficient authority, insufficient resources, or insufficient willingness to act on what the available evidence showed. In 2008, the global financial crisis that had begun in the American subprime mortgage market reached Ireland with a force amplified by the specific vulnerabilities of the Irish banking system. Irish bank shares collapsed. The scale of losses on property loans became progressively clearer, and what became clear was that those losses were not survivable without state intervention. On the night of the 29th of September 2008, the Irish government issued a guarantee covering virtually all of the liabilities of the 6 main Irish financial institutions, a decision made in crisis conditions with incomplete information about the scale of the losses being guaranteed. The guarantee stabilized the immediate banking crisis. It also transferred an enormous private debt onto the Irish state. By 2010, Ireland could no longer borrow in international markets at sustainable rates. The European Union and the International Monetary Fund negotiated an €85 billion bailout programme with the Irish government, a programme coming with conditions requiring severe austerity measures implemented over years by governments whose electoral mandates had not included the programme they were now required to execute. The human consequences were visible and various. The construction cranes came down. Development sites across the city were abandoned. Half-built apartment blocks standing empty in a cityscape that felt, in the early austerity years, like something between a building site and a ruin. Unemployment rose sharply, reaching 14% by 2012. Emigration resumed. A new wave of young Irish people left for London and Sydney and Toronto and Berlin. This generation's children of the boom were taking the same route out that every previous generation of economic difficulty had taken. The anger that accompanied the crash was specific and legitimate. People who had taken out mortgages at the height of the boom found themselves in negative equity, owning properties worth less than the debt attached to them. The question asked at kitchen tables across the country, with a mixture of fury and despair, was how did this happen? And who was responsible? And why did none of the people whose job it was to prevent this actually prevent it? The answers that emerged from tribunals, commissions of inquiry, and years of investigative journalism painted a picture of systemic failure across multiple institutions, a culture of deference to developers and bankers that prevented the critical scrutiny those relationships required. regulatory bodies lacking either the authority or the will to intervene when the evidence warranted it. The recovery came, hesitantly at first, and then, with gathering confidence from around 2013 onward, by 2017, Dublin was growing again. The technology companies were still there. The cranes were rising again. The Celtic Tiger had not simply died. It had taken a very damaging pause and resumed with most of its habits intact and fewer of its illusions. What had changed? In the people who had lived through both the boom and the crash was something harder to measure than a growth rate. A wariness. A knowledge that the good times are not a destination but a weather system, and that weather systems change. Whether that knowledge would survive the next cycle of prosperity long enough to matter, only the future would tell. Chapter 13. Dublin Now. A city still becoming. Stand on Halfpenny Bridge one more time, not at the beginning of the story but at its current edge, where the documented past gives way to the contested present. The Liffey still moves beneath you in its grey-green way, indifferent as it has always been to the arguments conducted on its banks. The city around you is recognisably the city that has been building and rebuilding itself for 1,200 years. The Georgian facades, the Victorian bridges, the medieval street pattern persisting beneath the modern grid, the two cathedrals standing in their current forms since the Norman centuries. But Dublin, in 2026, is also a city under pressures that have no direct historical parallel. And navigating those pressures while remaining the city it has always been is the challenge defining this particular moment in its long existence. The housing crisis that began developing in the years following the post-crash recovery has become the defining domestic political issue of Irish life. The mechanisms are not mysterious. Dublin is a city in which demand for housing substantially exceeds supply, produced by the combination of a growing population, the presence of major international employers generating well-paid employment, a construction sector still recovering from the crash's damage, and a planning and regulatory system that has not consistently produced the volume of housing the city needs at the pace it needs it. The consequences are visible and human. Rents in Dublin have been identified in multiple housing affordability analyses from the early 2020s, including reports from the Housing Agency of Ireland and comparative European studies, as among the least affordable in Europe relative to average local income. Homelessness reached levels in the early 2020s that would have been unimaginable in any previous period of Irish economic stability, with official figures from the Department of Housing recording numbers that do not include all of those whose housing situations are precarious without meeting the formal definition. Young Dubliners, including those with good professional incomes, face the prospect of spending a decade or more in rental accommodation before accumulating the capital for a home purchase. The irony impossible to ignore is that the city generating this crisis is also the European headquarters of some of the most valuable companies on earth. Google's European base is here. Meta's, the companies whose platforms are used daily by hundreds of millions of Americans, are, in significant part, administered from a city on the western edge of Europe that most of those users could not locate precisely on a map. The employment those companies create has prevented the emigration that previous generations of economic difficulty produced. The salaries they pay have contributed, along with housing supply failure, to a market in which the cost of living in Dublin is increasingly difficult to reconcile with the wages available to people who do not work for a technology company. This is a version of a problem that cities like San Francisco and London and Amsterdam have been living with for longer than Dublin, and none of them has solved it in a way providing a clear template. The referendum of May 2015, in which Ireland became the first country in the world to introduce same-sex marriage by popular vote, was a moment of cultural self-definition that genuinely surprised many observers. including many Irish people. The margin of the vote, over 62% in favour, according to the official referendum results, was larger than most polls had predicted. It reflected a transformation in the social attitudes of the Irish population that had been building for a generation, but whose scale was not fully visible until it was expressed in a national ballot. The referendum on the Eighth Amendment in May 2018, which removed the constitutional prohibition on abortion and opened the way for the legalisation of termination services in Ireland, produced a similarly decisive result, with over 66% voting to repeal according to the official count. The two referendums together represented, within 3 years, a fundamental reorientation of the Irish state's relationship to the social teaching of the Catholic Church that had shaped its legislation and its public culture for most of its independent existence. The Church that had been the dominant institutional force in Irish public life for the better part of a century was not absent from these debates. It was simply no longer determinative in them. People had not, in most cases, abandoned their faith. They had separated their faith from their political allegiance to an institution that had used the power entrusted to it to harm the most vulnerable people in its care. That separation, achieved at considerable personal and communal cost, is one of the most significant cultural transformations in modern Irish history. The question of Northern Ireland, deferred rather than resolved by the partition of 1921, returned to the active political agenda with the consequences of the Brexit vote of 2016. The United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union created a border problem that the architects of the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 had not anticipated. The agreement, endorsed in separate referendums north and south of the border, ended the Troubles and established the framework for governance in Northern Ireland that has, with significant difficulties and interruptions, maintained a level of political normalcy that the preceding 30 years of violence had made seem impossible. Brexit removed the assumption underpinning that achievement. The negotiation of the Northern Ireland Protocol and its successor, the Windsor Framework, which kept Northern Ireland effectively within the European Union's single market for goods while remaining part of the United Kingdom, represented a creative but contested response to an unprecedented situation. The political instability in Northern Ireland that followed Brexit reflected the degree to which the border question remains capable of disrupting the fragile equilibrium that 1998 had achieved. The question of Irish reunification, a theoretical aspiration of Irish constitutional politics since partition, began to be discussed in more practical terms in the years following Brexit. The conversations in Dublin about reunification are, among those who have thought carefully about them, conversations about cost and complexity as much as about aspiration and history. Reunification, if and when it comes, would require the Southern Irish state to absorb a Northern Ireland with different institutional systems, different levels of public expenditure, and a unionist population whose identity and political allegiance cannot be wished away or legislated out of existence. The city that is Dublin in 2026 is a city of extraordinary diversity, whose streets would be unrecognisable to anyone who knew the city 50 years ago. The Irish-born children of Nigerian and Brazilian and Polish and Chinese parents are Dubliners, in the same way that the children of famine survivors who returned from Boston in the 1990s are Dubliners, and in the same way that the Hiberno-Norse children of Viking fathers and Gaelic mothers were Dubliners in the 10th century. The city has always been absorbing the world. It has always been making something new from what it absorbs. That process has never been clean. It has never been finished. It was never supposed to be either. What connects that present reality to the dark pool at the beginning of this story is not a straight line. It is something more like the river itself, bending and doubling back and sometimes appearing to flow in the wrong direction before finding its way again. The Gaelic farmers who worked the land around the Liffey confluence did not plan for the Viking longfort. The Vikings who built that longfort did not plan for the Norman castle. The Normans who razed Dublin Castle did not plan for the Reformation that would fracture the society they had created. And none of them planned for the particular city that exists today. But if you asked any one of them whether the place they had built on this dark pool on this river was worth the trouble of building it, the answer would have been yes. More than 31 million Americans are descended from people who left this city and this country, many of them with nothing in their hands but the memory of what they had lost and the intention of not losing it again. They built communities in Boston and New York and Chicago and Philadelphia that kept that memory alive for generations. They sent money and support and their own children back toward a country many of them had never seen, because someone in their family line had seen it and had not been able to forget it. That is not sentiment. That is one of the most remarkable acts of sustained collective memory in modern history. And it begins here, at this river, at this dark pool, at this city that has been losing people and absorbing people and arguing about itself and building itself back from the rubble of its own history for 1,200 years without once, not even in its worst moments, deciding that the project was not worth continuing. The Poddle still flows beneath the streets, finding its way to the Liffey in the dark. The Liffey still finds its way to the sea. The city still finds its way forward, imperfectly and noisily, and with the particular energy of a place that has survived everything it has been through and knows, without needing to say it, that survival is not the same thing as defeat. Dublin was never finished. It never will be. That is not its failure. It never was. It is the whole point